The Paternal Metaphor IV, 5th of February 1958, Part 1 of 4. Everyone is talking about symbolization. An article came out in English in May-June 1956 with the title Symbolism and its Relationship to the Primary and Secondary Processes by Charles Rycroft, in which he tries to give an up-to-date account of where we have got to in the analysis of symbolism. Those of you who read English would clearly benefit from reading such an article, since this one will show them the difficulties that have always been occurring in relation to the meaning to give to the word symbolism in psychoanalysis. And I mean not simply to the word, but to the way it is used, to the idea that we are engaged in a symbolic process. It is true that since 1911, when Mr. Jones produced the first significant work overviewing the whole subject, the question has passed through several different phases and has encountered, and still encounters, very great difficulties in regard to what currently constitutes the most fully articulated position on this subject, meaning the one that comes out of Mrs. Melanie Klein's reflections on the importance of symbol formation in the development of the ego. This has the closest relevance to what I am in the process of explaining to you, and I would like to try to give you a sense of its significance from the point of view I am in the process of trying to make you understand, in order to shed a little bit of light onto the otherwise obscure directions it has been taken in. I am not sure from what end I am going to approach it today. I don't have a plan as to the way I am going to present things. I would like, since it is a kind of penultimate session that I have announced to you, leaving very precisely the question of the phallus and comedy for next week, I would like today simply to mark a kind of full stop by showing you several significant directions over which what I have expounded at the beginning of this term concerning the castration complex allows us to raise question marks. So I am going to begin by looking at the theories as they come. Today on this subject it is not possible to put into a strict order something that must above all be regarded these days as being at a kind of crossroads. In this title of Charles Rycroft's, you have just seen the appearance of primary and secondary processes. This is something I have never discussed in front of you, and yet, a while ago, it took certain of you by surprise. They stumbled into this primary and secondary process in the context of generating vocabulary definitions and were a little bit surprised. The primary and secondary processes date from the time of the Traumdeutung, and it is something that is not entirely identical with, but overlays the opposing notions of the pleasure principle and the reality principle. As for the pleasure principle and the reality principle, I have more than once alluded to them in front of you, always in order to get you to take note that the way they are made use of is incomplete if they are not considered in relation to each other, meaning if we are not aware of their link, their opposition, as being constitutive of the position of each of these terms. I want to get straight to the heart of the subject I have just raised, the notion of the pleasure principle as the principal element of the primary process. When it is taken in an isolated way, it leads to this, and it is from there that Charles Rycroft believes he has to start in order to define primary process. He believes that all the structural features must be put to one side, that the aspect that therein dominates one of the constitutional elements of it, effectively as condensation, displacement, etc., must be put in the background. Everything that Freud began by broaching when he defined the unconscious and he fundamentally characterizes it by what Freud draws out in his final elaboration of his theory in relation to the Traumdeutung, i.e., that the pleasure principle is essentially constituted by this: that there is a mechanism, and that originally and principally, whether you take it from the point of view of it as a biographical stage, or from the point of view of it as an underlying process, a foundation on which something else has developed, a kind of base of psychic depth, or even if you take it as a kind of logical relationship, it's from here that it has to be approached. There would be, let's say for the human subject, obviously it couldn't be about anything else, although the point is not clearly made, there would be, in response to a drive stimulation, always the virtual possibility, and in some way as constitutive of the principle of the subject's position in relation to the world, a tendency towards the hallucinatory satisfaction of desire. I don't think this will surprise you, expressed profusely by all the theorists, this reference to this, that, as a result of a primitive experience, and modelled by reflection, to every internal excitation of the subject there is a corresponding. Before there is a corresponding something, there is the instinctual cycle, the movement, though it may be uncoordinated, of the appetite, then the searching, then the locating in reality of what satisfies the need by way of mnemonic traces of what has already fulfilled the desire, which brings satisfaction. Satisfaction purely and simply, that tends to reproduce itself in a hallucinatory way. This is something which has almost become consubstantial with our analytic conceptions, that we need to make use of, I will say, almost in an implicit way, every time we discuss the pleasure principle. Doesn't it seem to you, to a certain extent, that this is something that is outlandish enough to deserve some elucidation, because, in the end, if it is in the nature of the cycle of psychical processes to create one's own satisfaction for oneself, I could ask, why don't people just satisfy themselves? Of course, it's that the need continues to press, because the fantastical satisfaction cannot fulfill all the needs. But we know all too well that in the sexual realm, definitely in every instance, it is eminently susceptible to meet the need when it concerns the drive need. For hunger, it is not the same, and after all, we can see it appearing over the horizon that this is exactly it. It is the very possibly illusory aspect of the sexual object that it is about here. This conception exists and, in a certain way, is in effect prompted by the possibility of being self-sustaining, at least at a certain level, at the level of sexual satisfaction. This is something that has so profoundly impregnated analytic thought that, to the extent that this relationship of need can be satisfied, i.e., the primordial gratifications or satisfactions or frustrations too that are considered to be diverse when the life of the subject begins, i.e., in the subject's relationship with his mother, has come to the forefront, i.e., that it is, overall, in a dialectic of need and of satisfaction that psychoanalysis has gone more and more into, to the extent that it has concerned itself more and more with the primitive stages of the subject's development, i.e., the relationship between the infant and the mother. We have arrived at something in relation to which I want to highlight for you the significant aspect, and also, moreover, the necessary aspect. It is this one. In the Kleinian perspective, which is the one that I am indicating at the moment, i.e., where the whole apprenticeship to reality undertaken by the subject is in some way primordially prepared and upheld by the essentially hallucinatory and fantastical constitution of the first objects, classified as good and bad objects, insofar as they anchor in some way a first, altogether primordial relationship that is going to create, in what follows, in the life of the subject's principal kinds of modes of relating to reality. We end up with a type of composition of the subject's world that is made from a sort of fundamentally unreal relationship between the subject and his objects that are nothing but the reflection of his fundamental drives. It is, for example, around the subject's fundamental aggressivity that everything is going to be coordinated in a series of the subject's projected needs. This world of the fantasy with a PH, as it is used in the Kleinian school, is fundamental, and it is on the surface of this that, according to a series of more or less fortunate experiences, it is preferable that they are fortunate enough for this, that the world of experience is going to allow a certain reasonable plotting of what, in these objects, is, as it is said, objectively definable as responding to any specific reality, the fabric of unreality remaining in some way absolutely fundamental. It is, if I may say so, the kind of construction that could truly be called a psychotic construction of the subject, which means, in short, that a normal subject is, in this perspective, a psychosis that has turned out well, a psychosis that is in some kind of fortunate harmony with experience. And this is not my reconstruction. The theorist I am going to talk about now, Mr. Winnicott, expressly says this in a text he has written on the use of regression in analytic therapy. The fundamental homogeneity between psychosis and a normal relationship to the world is absolutely affirmed as such therein. This doesn't prevent very big difficulties emerging from this perspective, if only in arriving at a conception of, since the fantasy is only in some way the subjacent fabric to the world of reality, to see what the function of fantasy could be, as recognized as such by the subject, in the adult stage, and finished and successful in the constitution of his real world. This is exactly the problem that must present itself to every self-respecting Kleinian, meaning every self-professed Kleinian, and currently one could just as well say almost every analyst, insofar as the register in which they inscribe the relationship of the subject to the world has become more and more exclusively that of an apprenticeship to the world, based on the more or less successful overcoming of a series of experiences of frustration. I urge you to look up Mr. Winnicott's article, which is to be found in volume 26 of the International Journal of Psychoanalysis, and which is called Primitive Emotional Development, in order to understand the need for the emergence, the conceptualization of this world of fantasy as it is consciously lived by the subject, and insofar as it balances out his reality as demanded by clinical experience. And it has to be noted that in this text itself, for those who are interested, he draws on a remark, the necessity of which can be felt, as you are going to see, as it results in an altogether curious paradox. The emergence of the reality principle, in other words, the recognition of reality based on the primordial relations of the infant to the maternal object, satisfying object and also unsatisfying object, does not in any way allow us to see how, from there, the world of fantasy emerges in its, if we can call it that, adult form, except through an artifice, to which Mr. Winnicott alerts us, that certainly allows for a coherent enough development of the theory, but of which I simply wish to make you see the paradox that it represents. It is this. He notes that if the hallucinatory satisfaction of need is fundamentally discordant with this satisfaction with what the mother brings to the infant, It's in this discordance that the gap is going to open up, in which the infant can, in a certain way, constitute a first acknowledgement of the object that, despite appearances, if you will, is disappointing. So, to explain, in short, how this thing can be born that amounts to, for the modern psychoanalyst, everything to do with the world of fantasy and imagination, i.e. to what is called playing in English, he points this out. Let's suppose that, at the appointed moment, the maternal object arrives for the fill-up. The infant has only just started to call for the breast when the mother brings it to him. Here, Mr. Winnicott comes to a stop for good reason and poses the following question. In these conditions, what will allow the child to distinguish between the hallucination, the hallucinatory satisfaction of his desire, and reality? To put it another way, starting from this point, we are strictly led to expressing the following equation: that at the origin it is absolutely impossible to distinguish the hallucination from the fulfilled desire. Doesn't it seem to you that we cannot avoid being struck by the paradox of this confusion? From a perspective that rigorously characterizes the primary process as initially being naturally satisfied in a hallucinatory way, we are led to the following: that the more reality is satisfying, as it were, the less it constitutes a reality test, and that the origin of the infant's omnipotent thinking is essentially based on everything that may have been successful in reality. This holds up in a certain way, but you have to admit that, in itself, it introduces a paradoxical aspect, and that the very necessity of resorting to something so paradoxical to explain, in short, a pivotal point of the subject's development is something that lends itself to reflection or even questioning. Right. Now I am going to, in contrast to what it might seem possible to propose in response to this conception that, don't misunderstand me, I don't think that, as completely paradoxical as it is, and downright paradoxical, it must also have some ramifications. It certainly has all sorts of ramifications. I already alerted you to them last year when I made allusion to this same article of Mr. Winnicott's, i.e. that, in what follows from his anthropology, the effect is none other than to make him classify more or less everything that can be called open conjecture as being of the same order as the fantastical aspects of thinking. I already told you about it last year. There is here a complete assimilation between the fantastical life and everything of the order of, however fully elaborated theoretically, i.e. everything that can be called convictions, more or less whatever they are, political, religious or other. Something that is the kind of point of view that we could well see as being part of a dry, typically Anglo-Saxon sense of humour, with the kind of perspective that includes mutual respect, tolerance, but also reticence. There's a whole series of things about which one only speaks in parenthesis, or about which well brought up people do not speak. But these are, however, things that count for something, because they are part of the interior discourse, that cannot be reduced to